All right, so let's get going on today's class. So today we are going to continue our look at Chapter 9, Conceptual Knowledge. So this is going to be Conceptual Knowledge Part 2, where we wrap up our look at the spreading activation model, look at some implications, and then start to look at how that might be implemented in a real world physical symbol system with connectionist networks. So this is continuing our look at how knowledge in the mind is connected, how concepts and ideas and notions and relations are connected in the human mind. So the human mind, one of the possible ways that it is organized is just this massively interconnected series of nodes and relations that activate certain nodes, deactivate certain other nodes, and help us store our knowledge and do cognition, as we're going to see today. So just a real quick recap. We're going to start with Collins and Loftus's spreading activation model, quick recap. And then we're going to take a look at what implications does this model have for things like stereotypes and racism and sexism. So just by way of a quick recap, Collins and Loftus, their spreading activation model was a revision of the hierarchical model by Collins and Killian. Their new features were first that it was not strictly hierarchical, so that was a big time revision. And then that links between concepts can have different travel times. Activation can spread from both category and exemplar nodes. And these links can have different strengths considering how associated they are with different concepts. So the idea is that if you have a concept like red, then in their spreading activation model, it will be linked to many other concepts that are associated with red. And then those concepts will be linked to other concepts that are associated with them. So red is linked to fire truck is linked to ambulance vehicle and truck. So red is thereby linked by a second order connection to ambulance vehicle and truck, and so on and so forth with connections between different concepts. And those branching off of red include things like different colors. It includes things like roses and flowers that are red. It includes things like fruit that are red. And then those fruits are associated with things with fruit that are not red, but they're all connected in this spreading activation model. And in this way, we can represent our knowledge as a series of connections of differing strengths and differing lengths between different concepts. So importantly, most highly associated concepts are linked directly to another concept. So again, fire engine, rose, the idea of green being the opposite of red, those are all linked directly to red. But we have these secondary connections as well. And because of that, when red is activated in this model, when you start thinking about red, when you read the word red, whenever you start interacting in your mind and doing cognitive work with the idea of red, you activate that node so that you can start thinking about red. But that's not the only thing that happens in this model. Once you activate a single node, that activation spreads and it starts to activate other nodes as well. Now, it might not activate them to the point where they are being consciously thought about, might not activate it to the point where you are now consciously aware of roses and sunsets and apples. But importantly, you are primed and ready to be consciously aware of those things. And that sub-activation can also influence certain cognitions that you have, certain emotions that you have as well, just by activating that core concept of red. And then to further this, once those secondary concepts that are linked to red are partially activated, this spreading activation model indicates that they too will send activation forward, and that will spread to secondary activations. So whenever you think about a concept, it's not just that concept that starts to get activated in your mind. It's all the concepts that are related to that concept also start getting activated and also start being primed and ready for you to think about them. And even at this subconscious activation can still influence things like your emotions and your cognitions in ways that you are not aware of. All right, so last time we took a look at what implications this model might have for the term global warming as a term. And we made the argument that the term global warming to refer to climate change was actually a horrible term to adopt because its two components, global and warming, were very much associated before this climate change issue became more mainstream. In the beginning, it was very much associated with two things that we have very positive feelings towards. So most people have positive feelings towards the earth, towards being global. So we have ideas like Mother Earth, Mother Nature, these things that make you feel good. You want to be more global. You don't want to be isolated and local. You want to be global. So global was associated with positive emotions. And then warm, the concept of warm is usually something that is associated with positive emotions as well. You want nice warm cookies. You get a hug from your friend and it makes you feel all warm inside. Where do you want to go on vacation this year? Oh, I want to go somewhere warm, right? These are all ideas that there is something at our core that makes us feel good when we think about warm. And that's the idea that indicates that global warming was a horrible term because it primes people not to feel negative or not to feel negative emotions for the concept of global warming. So before you even learn what it is, you hear the word global and you're thinking, oh, hope, curiosity, compassion, inspiration, empowerment, pride. That's amazing. Warming, comfort, affection, love, trust, happiness, and gratitude. That's amazing as well. I don't know what global warming is because this is the first time I heard that term, but that sounds great. Count me in. I want to be a part of global warming. Let's make global warming happen, right? I mean, these seem to be good concepts. So, because of that problem, Seth Godin suggested that what we should have called global warming is too late now, but what we should have called global warming would have been something like atmosphere cancer. And if you went to somebody and said, hey, I heard about this new thing, atmosphere cancer, nobody is going to think to themselves, oh, that sounds nice. I feel good about atmosphere cancer. They're not going to have those pleasant emotions because the word cancer comes with very different associations. When you hear the word cancer, that activation that spreads from that idea of cancer spreads to ideas like fear, like anxiety, like sadness, like shock, like anger, like determination, all ideas that we need in order to properly address the threat that climate change and global warming is posing to our world. So we talked about that. What implications does this model have for global warming as a term? And then I left you as a sort of thought homework idea. What implications does this model have for stereotypes, racism, sexism, etc.? So I'm going to assume that you probably have a lot of ideas about what this means for racism, sexism, and stereotypes, and you're probably wondering, well, what does he want to hear? So let's pose this a little bit differently. Let's say that we have the idea of a black male, right? So we have that node somewhere in our connectionist spreading activation model. We have the idea of a black male. Somebody with racist stereotypes, what would be connected to that node? So the racist stereotypes would definitely be activated there. Where you got the information from is a really interesting one because it would be activated because sometimes you do remember where you got information from. But there's also this ability that we have called source monitoring. And source monitoring is our ability to remember where information came from. And as it turns out, we're not completely bad at that, but we're actually pretty bad at that. And that's why oftentimes you'll hear people say, well, I think I read it somewhere or I heard it somewhere, probably in a book. And it turns out to be on a Facebook post that they, got their information from. So that's one of the big challenges in terms of this information that we now have access to is that when we get exposed to information, it's very difficult to remember sometimes where did we hear it, i.e., did we hear it from a credible source or did we not hear it from a credible source? Well, it would spark hippo without you thinking about the book if you had associations with alligators and hippos, because, and as we're going to see, because you saw them together in different places. So you saw them both when you went to the zoo. You saw them both on one of those alphabet learning posters where A is for alligator and H is for hippo. If you see two things together, and this is going to be one of the, this will be a hint. If you see two things together, you form an association between those things, whether you want to form that association or not, or whether you rationally think that is a good association to have or not. So when you're watching this news, when you're watching news and you say you're watching Fox News, that information that you learn will be tied to Fox News. As much as we sometimes have difficulty remembering where we saw things, it will be tied to Fox News. So whatever is connected to Fox News would then also start to get activated. And whatever is connected to that will also start to get activated. So not to the point where you might be thinking about it, but definitely to the point where now it's ready and it's primed for you to very quickly bring it up to mind, or at the very least have it influence your emotions, which then helps you influence your decisions. So based on that idea, for these concepts of racism and stereotypes that pervade, I won't ask anybody here to admit to those because it is a bit of a sensitive topic. But if I asked you, if this was a test and I said, write down as many negative stereotypes that you can for black males, how many people think they could write 5? Okay, not ones that you agree with, but just if you were to, if I was to say, think of the most racist person in the world, what do they think of black males? Can you name 5 things? You'd probably be able to say, oh yeah, I know what they're thinking. Can you name 10 things? You'd probably be able to bang those out as well. So the idea is that you have these ideas represented in your network, represented in your spreading activation network. And as we're going to see, that can be a big, big problem. So, one of the big questions is, where do a lot of these connections come from? Because sometimes it's explicitly taught, right? So, if you have parents that are racist, probably you have been actually taught these racist stereotypes. You've actually been taught these racist connections. But the other place that it can come from, and this is the more dangerous and insidious forms of well, maybe not more dangerous, definitely more insidious, definitely more pervasive forms of racism, come from the associations that we see mostly in our culture, mostly in our media that we consume. So when I was putting together this lecture, and I do this whenever I update this portion of the lecture, I go to Google. And if you ever want to know what associations are being formed or what associations are present in our culture at the moment, Google is a wonderful resource because you can search something for Google in Google and then see what comes up, and those are going to be the associations that are now in our culture. So one of the negative stereotypes associated with black males is that they're criminals, right? That black males are criminals. If you Googled, and this was a few days ago, criminal in a Google search term, these are the images that came up. So we have pictures of Sean Diddy Combs, but more importantly, we have pictures of a black male with the word criminal, right? So we were looking for criminal and we found pictures of black males. In that instant, consuming this media, you have now strengthened that association between criminal and black male. You're not going to be rationally convinced that there's that criminals and black males are equal or that they're rationally related. But importantly, that link has been strengthened. That link has been established so that the next time you think of criminal, your node for black male is going to be slightly more activated. Another stereotype is not only are black males criminals, but they are oftentimes involved with gun violence. So I looked up shooting for, again, in Google, and we had mostly innocuous, not associated with any particular race, images, except for this one right here. And I looked at the article for this, and it goes 6 in custody after Army veteran shot, killed during Oak Park carjacking. He was a fighter. This is the person that was shot. This is not the criminal. This is not the shooter. This is actually the victim of that crime. But the association was already created because I was thinking about shooting. I saw that particular black male picture in this news article. That association has been strengthened. So this is one of the reasons why representation in media is such an important issue. Because one of the things that's very difficult to get behind in the media is if you're a working class person and you hear about pay disparity in movies and TV shows, you hear about differences of opportunities in movies and TV shows, and you're talking about people that make millions of dollars for a month of work, it's kind of hard to get behind them and say, oh yeah, I think there should be more representation for these underrepresented millionaires because I'm struggling to pay my rent and make sure that there's food on the table, but let's make sure that millionaires have that opportunity to make more millions. That's not a very convincing argument. And that's not a very important social issue. But what is an important social issue is what is the spreading activation networks that we are creating when we consume media. And if we don't have representation in media, then we are skewing what we're creating in terms of our spreading activation model. We are skewing what are the connections that we are strengthening in our spreading activation model. So just by way of example, one of the most classic films of the 90s exploded Quentin Tarantino's status in Hollywood was Pulp Fiction. And one of the iconic characters from Pulp Fiction was Jules. And he was a sermon quoting hitman with a hair trigger temper. And this image here, every single time you see it, it's going to strengthen that association between blackmail and gun. You know that you're watching a movie, but again, you see the blackmail, you see the gun, strengthen that association, blackmail and gun. You see a black male and he's angry, strengthen that association between blackmail and angry. So every single time this happens, you strengthen that association. Now, for those of you that have seen Pulp Fiction, you'll know that John Travolta was also in that movie, also had a gun, also was violent. So those associations are being strengthened as well. However, the question then becomes, how many times do you strengthen those associations between a white male and gun, white male and violent temper? And how many times is it strengthened between the association between black male and gun and black male and temper? And if there is no diversity and representation in the way that, in the roles that people are offered and that they get, it turns out that skews very heavily, and we are being conditioned to strengthen those associations, strengthen those connections between the very stereotypes that we don't want to have in our cognitive systems. So just to give you another example, this is from about 30 years ago, I think, but just a more contemporary example. So the Netflix film, they cloned Tyrone. John Boyega plays a character called Fontaine, and Fontaine is a drug dealer. So again, once you see that, once you watch this film and you're like, okay, well, there's a black male drug dealer, that association gets strengthened. And it's not that it's going to convince you that all black males are drug dealers, but what it does do is it makes it much more easy to think about drug dealing when you think about a black male. And it's a lot easier to think about gun violence when you think about a black male, and a lot easier to think about violent tempers when you think about a black male. You are ready to think about those things. And importantly, that readiness is going to influence your decision making and your emotions when that node gets activated. So other common stereotypes that get strengthened through association. The hypersexuality of black males is something else that is pervasive in our media. So we have here Way Too Sexy by Drake, featuring Future and Young Thug. And again, this was done in a parody way. This was done in a sort of funny, haha parody association. But at the same time, one of the important things to realize is that your mind cannot filter oftentimes what is parody versus what is real. It cannot filter what you want it to attend to or what you don't want it to attend to. Basically, much like we saw in the suffix effect, when you were trying to remember the sequence of numerals and you were told in the instructions, do not remember zero, and zero still found its way into your working memory. The same way you could watch this and say, well, this is just a joke. This is just a parody. This is just a spoof. Does not matter. Those associations are still going to get strengthened. So other examples, Shake Some by the Baby. And this video, I had to scroll through many portions of this video before I found something that I was comfortable showing in class. But again, this idea of this hypersexuality gets strengthened. You see this, and that stereotype of the hypersexual black male gets strengthened in this activation model. So what that means, again, is that when you have in your spreading activation model for a black male, whether or not you are racist, whether or not you, how can I say this, consciously racist, I guess would be one of the ways to say it. Whether or not you are, as long as you have these associations, you have them represented in your mind. And they're represented in this spreading activation model. So if you went up to Dr. Bryant, right, our community psychology expert here, racial justice activist, if you asked her, what are the stereotypes that black males face? She could list off a list of those ideas. She is not racist, but she has that represented somewhere in her knowledge system. She has that represented somewhere in her spreading activation model, which means that she is also susceptible to that spreading activation that occurs. So again, we have the idea that black male is associated with crime, is associated with, it's auto-corrected, thug, violent and gang, is associated with drug dealer, drug addict, and gun, is associated with threat, hypersexual, and player, is associated with dropout and poor, which are associated with welfare, is associated with scary and angry, which are associated with hostile. So again, if you're aware of these stereotypes, you have this represented in your spreading activation model, according to Collin and Loftus. And what that means is that when you start thinking about black males, that activation spreads. And you are more ready to think about them as threats, to think about them as scary, to think about them as criminals. And whether or not that's consciously activated, it's going to influence your decision making, it's going to influence your emotional decisions and your emotional experience. It's basically going to affect your behavior in this way, in a negative way, because of these negative stereotypes. So what that basically means is that as we consume media, we are forming these associations. So after you watch They Cloned Tyrone, you have strengthened your association between black male and drug dealer. After you watch Pulp Fiction, you have increased your association between, or strengthened your association between black males and guns and crime. And after you watch hip hop videos, you have strengthened your association between black males and hypersexuality. So why is this an issue that can be solved with representation? Why would representation maybe be an antidote to this model right here? Any ideas? Yeah, well, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up where you said, I'm trying to think of a black character that doesn't have these associations. That kind of leans right into, the issue here, that it's difficult sometimes to think about, well, what is the black character that doesn't have these types of associations? And honestly, it was not difficult to find black characters that had these associations. And that's part of the issue. So you're right about the representation leads to a more diverse, connected network. And once you have a more diverse, connected network, when your activation spreads, it'll spread to negative stereotypes. As long as you know the negative stereotypes, as long as, when I say something like, well, in our society, black males are associated with crime, and you're not sitting there going, what? Like, I've never heard this. As long as you're kind of like, oh, yeah, I heard that before, it's in your activation network. We don't want to forget about it. We don't want to be oblivious. But what we want to do is we want to strengthen those automatic connections to other more truthful associations between the concept of, for example, black male and other things. So I didn't even notice this until you brought it up. I have one good example of a character that kind of goes almost against everything that was here. That's a fictional character. For counter examples, I'm just realizing right now, I kind of went to real life. So Barack Obama is a great example. So here we have a black male, and every time you saw him, you associated black male with leadership. Every time you saw him, you associated black male with competence, black male with success, black male with a stable marriage, right? Every time you saw him, you would strengthen those associations. Somebody like Neil deGrasse Tyson, every time you see him, whether or not you're thinking about this or not, you associate black male with intelligence, black male with, a very competent discussion style, black male that is a big critical thinker. And then I mentioned the fictional character, and one of the ones that really struck me when I saw this film, and I really, really wish this film took off, and I wish the franchise took off, and I just wish it became one of those billion-dollar franchises. Unfortunately, it did not. But it was the Power Rangers movie that came out in 2017. In the Power Rangers movie that came out in 2017, they had the Blue Ranger. And the Blue Ranger, he was a black male. So here we have a hero that is a black male, but it went even further than that. Because again, you can have a hero that is wielding a gun, and your mind will still associate black male with gun violence. You can have a hero that will lose their temper at the end because their best friend just got killed, and you're going to associate black male with temper. He was a almost perfect example of counter programming to increase associations that are in your spreading activation model that typically don't occur, because not only was he a black male, but he was their master of operations. He was their science guy. So he was the one that knew all the technical stuff, all the technical jargon, got them out of all their sort of scientific technical problems. But more important than that, he was nonviolent. He was almost completely nonviolent. So I know it's a little weird to be in the Power Rangers and not be nonviolent, but he was nonviolent to the point where when he was getting bullied, when everybody was in detention, he didn't even defend himself. It fell upon the Red Ranger eventually to come up and stop this bully from bullying him, but he did not defend himself. So every single time this character was on screen, what you saw was black male intelligent, black male nonviolent, right? Black male not he had no romantic subplot, so black male not hypersexual. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's exactly where my mind went. So you got somebody like Miles Morales, which is the Spider-Man in Into the Spider-Verse, Spider Universe, and yeah, you have a lot of associations that are positive and would strengthen those positive associations. So he's very heroic. He does. I mean, he's a superhero, so he is going to go have fisticuffs and violence. But to my knowledge, if I remember correctly, he doesn't really lose his temper very much. He tries to stay calm-headed. He has good relationships, loving family. So those would be yep. So those would all be that would be a good example of one that would strengthen those different associations. It was You have a yep. Yeah. Are you asking if a white guy not fighting back kind of influences your ideas that black guys fight back more, kind of like a contrast effect? Um, I would say in according to Colin and Loftus's spreading activation model, it wouldn't strengthen the association between the opposite idea, but what it does do is it strengthens the relative association between the opposite idea. So if you have a connection between white males and fights, right? So you have a connection between white male and fights, and you see a white male that doesn't fight back. That association is going to get weaker. So let's say that it went from an association of 50 to an association of 25. Let's say it cut it in half. And then you have black male in fights, and that association stays at 50. Well, now you have the relative association has changed. So if you see a white male and a black male, now the black male will be more likely for you to think about, well, they're going to fight because they're violent, and less likely for the white male to think about it. But in terms of the overall activation, that would actually be lowered overall, but stay the same for the black male and lower for the white male. So I'll admit I know exactly the show that you're talking about, and I'd never noticed the black coding of Darwin. That wasn't something that I was aware of. But the way that it would work in terms of the Collins and Loftus spreading activation model is if you have anything that's when you talk about something that's coded, like if you're talking about something that's black coded, what you were really saying is that, well, there's a bunch of things that we're going to put together into this character that are associated with black people, but we're not going to show that him as a black character, but we're just going to have all these things associated with him. What that would do, according to Loftus's and Collins and Loftus's spreading activation model, is that it would increase the associations between the coded aspects of that black coded character without increasing the associations from that group to black individuals. However, if you strengthen the associations within the code, and then all of a sudden one of those nodes in that association gets connected to a black male later, right? So let's say that I'm trying to think of, well, what would be one example of Darwin being black coded? Yeah, I'm trying to. I mean, I know he's got legs. I know he sleeps in a fish bowl. Those are not. Okay. Well, let's say that just for sake of example, that it was the fact that he was adopted, right? So let's say that the fact that he was adopted is part of this coding that is going on for that character. But when you're watching The Amazing World of Gumball, not at all associating it with black individuals because Darwin isn't black. Once you form that activation network amongst all those black coded concepts, then the first time that you see a black person with one of those concepts, you're going to link it to that concept, and by those secondary links, you're going to link that concept to the black coded ideas. So if Darwin is being presented as as he is, a very positive way, and then you see another instance of a black person and they share something in common with Darwin, like they're both adopted, then that association is going to strengthen between black person and adopted. And because you've already strengthened that network by watching, multitude of Gumball episodes, then that's going to be associated with black person now through those secondary connections. So yeah, that actually might be a good strategy for counteracting this without maybe alienating people who would not watch something with a black character because they're starting at a position that is very much more intolerant and just don't want to expose themselves to those ideas. That's actually a really good idea. Like if you could have positive characters that are somehow, for example, black coded, then that would almost ready your network to counteract stereotypes the first time an actual black person is portrayed as having one of those concepts, and then it would just kind of pull in the rest of them by that spreading activation. All right, any other ideas? Okay, so we basically already touched on this, but let's just kind of put it in a visual so we can make it explicit. So when we have these associations, and we all do because we all are aware of these stereotypes, one of the ways that you can counteract it is basically by experiencing things that change the strength of those associations. So if we have these positive associations and we move this guy over here, let's get him in the center, and we have all of these associations here and they're all very strong. Once we start seeing people like Barack Obama, once we start seeing people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, once we start seeing people like the Blue Ranger, we will start having associations between those characters. And the more we see instances like that, the weaker relatively our connection to those negative stereotypes will be, and the stronger our connections to those positive stereotypes would be. So this is by far, at least for me, the most important reason why representation is a good thing in Hollywood and why it is something that should be pursued. Because again, whether you get an opportunity to sign on for a $5 million paycheck for making a movie really doesn't resonate with me and really doesn't resonate with the common person. But knowing that these associations are forming the stereotype underpinnings of our cognition is something that is incredibly important, and I believe is important to everybody that wants to build a better community. All right, so the last thing that I'll mention, and this is just to kind of drive home the importance of this, these spreading activation networks and these ideas of how your mind works are oftentimes very, very insidious and very resilient and very sort of, I would almost say, kind of underhanded. So when you have these spreading activation networks, oftentimes you can consciously, rationally say, I don't want to act like that. But the problem is that as long as that network stays in place at the strength that it is, it's going to influence your behavior. So as much as you can consciously and intentionally counteract certain behavior, it's very difficult to do that all the time as long as those underlying representations are there. So I learned this idea very recently about different types of racism. So there's individualized racism. That's when a person actually holds racist attitudes. There is systematic racism, and that's when a system has racist rules, either written or unwritten, built into the system. But recently I learned about internalized racism, and I am going to, I learned it on LinkedIn, and I'm going to forget her name, but I'm going to let this lady explain what it is, because she can do a better job than I can.
Finally, internalized racism. It shows up as diminished expectations or confidence that result from living in and around environments that perpetuate racial bias. The scientists who developed Harvard's implicit association test clearly demonstrate that members of a disadvantaged group often hold biases against their own group. Indeed, the unfortunate truth is that people of any color can hold racially biased views even against their own racial group. So as we examine racism, we must consider all three types: systemic, individual, and internalized.
All right, so the idea of internalized racism is just like, how bad can your mind betray you? As long as you are living in a environment where there's racial bias, as long as you're living in an environment that has biased ways of representing or thinking individuals, you will have a spreading activation network that is associated with the negative stereotypes as opposed to associated with the positive stereotypes. And if you do have those that are associated with the negative stereotypes, even if you are a black male, you will still behave in racist ways. You will still have that internalized racism. So further on in the course, they mentioned things like black people are less likely to apply for promotions, thereby perpetuating the sort of stereotype that they're not successful, that they're not doing well in the world financially. And again, this is coming from their own race. So, as much as you would like to think, well, consciously, I can fight this, I mean, who would have more motivation to consciously fight negative stereotypes than the people that are the target of those negative stereotypes? And yet it still influences them because of this spreading activation network. So we talked about one way of counteracting this with the media that we consume. Another way that we'll end with this idea is getting experiences that reprogram your spreading activation network in a way that's more consistent with what is actually going out there. And one of the best ways that you can do that is by actually having experiences and having relationships with different people from different backgrounds. So different types of people from different types of backgrounds. So the study that I'll point out just really quick was by Perry and Whitehead. And this was Christian nationalism and white racial boundaries, examining whites' opposition to interracial marriage. So they basically asked families, they basically asked parents, how willing would you be to let your daughter marry a black male? So this is kind of telling that they didn't ask the reverse question, how willing would you be to let your white son marry a black female? But anyways, they asked, how willing would you be to let your white daughter marry a black male? And then they took a look at all these sort of factors that affected whether or not they would be not at all comfortable or comfortable. So we're not going to go through what all the numbers mean. The only thing that I'm going to mention is what the asterisks mean. So the asterisk means that the effect of that factor was significant. It means that it made a difference. It means that it took them from not at all comfortable to slightly more comfortable in a way that was reliable and detectable and statistically real. It was a real difference. And the one that I want to focus on is this one right here, interracial contact. So if you did not have any close black friends, you are statistically significantly much more uncomfortable with your hypothetical white daughter marrying a black male. So that is significant. That is a significant difference. And basically what that says is that if you have experiences, if you have a close black friend that you have experiences with, that you have dinner with, that you go to the ball game with, that you do whatever else people do when they're interacting with others, every single time you have that interaction, you are re-strengthening positive associations. Considering that they're your friend, it'll be positive associations. You're strengthening those positive associations, making them relatively stronger than those weaker associations. So that when they ask you, would you be willing to let your daughter marry a black male? All of those positive associations get activated. Fewer of the negative associations get activated, or they get activated at a weaker amount. And then all of a sudden you're like, you know what? I kind of feel better about it. I kind of feel okay about it. Yeah. Whereas if you don't have those experiences, all you have is the negative stereotypes, and you're going to feel not at all comfortable with your white daughter marrying a black man. All right. So that's what I wanted to cover for the spreading activation model. And again, you can see just how important this is and just how much it guides us in terms of if we want to change the way that people think and behave, how do we best go about doing it? Before we leave that, any final questions, comments? All right.